Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to Erudite Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Indian Political Thought, we will be discussing about political thought of Manu. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Manindranath Thakur. Dr. Thakur is Associate Professor in Center for Political Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amrit. I'm going to talk about Manu's political views, mainly about some kind of philosophical arguments that he has developed, and the social hierarchy and the system of social law that he has developed. So, before I really begin with those things, let me clear out two things at least. One is the question of the authorship of the text. This has been always a controversy in most of the cases in Indian texts, that we are not sure who was the author of the text. One of the reasons of this controversy is that in Indian tradition, people don't have this idea of fixing text with an author. Generally, there used to be traditions, and within those traditions, text used to develop. So, people say that most of the Indian texts were not written in one go. They were written in a long span of time, and many people have included things in this. For instance, the same thing we talk about Mahabharata and also of Manu Smithy. Now, let me give you some reference about this. There is a person called Hopkins. He gives this hypothesis that the Manu's verses, the verses that you find in Manu, something more than 2,500 verses, they were actually spread in the society at the time, and it was kind of hearsay, a kind of proverb, kind of wisdom in society, and at some stage somebody like Manu must have accumulated them and put them in the textual form. This is one of the prominent ideas that people keep in mind. Therefore, you can easily see that such things are also available in society without knowing if they are coming from the texts. Similarly, you have Guiteaumer and Lariviere, who think that the texts are actually have evolved, and many authors have contributed to the text. There is also a very strong other viewpoint, like Patrick Olivelle. Patrick thinks that authors of legal treatise clearly drew upon such maxims and indeed on previous scholarships. I am quoting Patrick in composing their texts. The composition of these texts did not happen, and this is something very important that he is saying, that the composition of these texts did not happen as an unconscious and gradual accumulation at different hands at different times and places. These texts were authored by individuals with clear authorship intent. This is Patrick Olivelle's view. So, the point I want to bring home is that there are controversies, there are problems in fixing up the authorship of this text or these kind of texts. Similarly, there is also a problem of fixing up time. I do not want to go into the details of these things. I just wanted to mention that these issues always remain open. Somebody trying to look at the structure of the text would argue that it was written in different times. Somebody who would look at the tradition of Dharma Shastra would say that it was absolutely written by one person at one point of time. So, these controversies go on. This is not our concern at the moment. Similarly, there is a issue of genealogy of the text, the context of the text. There is a lot of controversy about this. We do not know actually. We have little historical evidence to suggest that it was actually written in one particular time, but a lot of people argue that this is a Dharmasastra tradition which was actually articulated, this particular text was articulated in this tradition after the collapse of Mauryan Empire during Ashoka's time. So, after Ashoka was a Buddhist and Buddhism was a state religion at that time, and there was a sharp reaction against this state religion among the Hindus, and the traditional Hindu Brahminical order was challenged under the Ashoka's rule or under the Buddhist dominance. So, there was a response from that, and there was a return of Brahminical rule after the collapse of Mauryan Empire. The Pushpamitra Shunga was the main architect of the new Brahminical empire, and a lot of people think that this text was actually produced at that time to re-establish Brahmanism. Therefore, you find a lot of references to caste and community and everything in this. There are a lot of discriminatory verses you can find that suggest that lower castes are basically to be controlled. So, again, I am not going into the genealogy of the text because it is a historian's job and they can find out what would be there. I would rather read the text more philosophically, and I think the text is very important philosophically too. It is said that a lot of successors of Manu, Vrihaspati and others, they have quoted Manu as great authority. In fact, Vrihaspati is quoted saying that Manu is the authority and any text contradicting Manu has no validity. Now, as we know, even Vrihaspati's identity is not known, so we do not know exactly who is saying what, but one thing is sure, that the text is considered to be important text in the tradition of Dharmasastra. You have history of rather recent history of text. Sir William Jones translated the text in 1794, and this translation became very important as it was the time when colonialism was establishing itself and they were trying to understand Hindus and Hinduism. It was a problem for them because they had this Christian religion which is a text based religion. So, it is very easy to understand what Christianity is saying if you go back to the text always. But Hinduism was never a text based religion, but to be a religion by their definition, the religion should have a text, a god and all. Now, by translating this text, it was also asserted that this was the Hindu text, this was the text which defined Hinduism. So, it became very important during the colonial period. You will find that in the colonial period a lot of people have talked about it, and they thought that, and a lot of writers in the West, they started interpreting Hinduism through Manu Smithy. A lot of people also did not take cognizance of it. We do not know exactly whether Manu Smithy was popular at that time or not among the people. As we know, the Gita was probably popular, as Gandhi picked up Gita. One of the reasons why Gandhi picked up Gita, or in fact most of the political leaders during the freedom struggle, they picked up Gita as a text and they reinterpreted Gita because they thought that, one, this was an important philosophical text which could have given them certain kind of a space to argue for freedom, and second, that it was also a fact that it was a popular text being referred in society in general. A lot of religious discourses were delivered on Gita, so people used to go and attend those discourses. So, it was a known text. I am not sure, rather it is very unlikely that Manu Smithy would have got that kind of a stature. Manu Smithy probably was a text and if one says that it was a lost text, one should not find it too exaggerating. It was discovered in 1794, and as lot of controversial issues were there inside it, it was taken as a good or a bad text by many people and created a lot of problems. Further, we will talk about that. Before we go into that, let us have a broad idea of what is Manu's system of thought. What is he out to do? See, these Smithy texts are basically texts which create some kind of authority and social law. You have many such texts, some samhitas, many samhitas, and you will find that they are basically talking about do's and don'ts in society. So, it is generally believed, there are two opinions on this. One, that probably they articulated, rather they accumulated the ongoing practices in society. The other opinion is that they probably tried to suggest some kind of practices which could bring society in order. We do not know whether at that time there were practices which were accumulated by them, but it is definitely sure, if we read the text that way, that they are prescribing certain kind of laws, certain kind of social laws that we must examine. What kind of social law and why are they prescribing, what is authority? Second thing is that to bring order in society, this text and many texts like that thought that probably we have to create certain kind of hierarchy. Hierarchy in the social space, hierarchy in terms of age and time, gender. So, certain kind of hierarchy if it is created, then probably order can be maintained. So, this is another point that this text probably emphasizes. We will see how it does that. Third thing is very interesting, and some people are arguing this point now, that in fact in the post-Mauryan phase and after a lot of debates that took place between Hinduism and Buddhism, this was a text of synthesis. It was synthesizing the debate. So, it brought together two things, the pravriti and nivriti. I will explain what is pravriti and nivriti and what is the meaning of bringing them together at some stage. So, these are the three things that one could look into this text, and this constitutes the system of thought. When I am saying law and authority, it includes social laws and also the idea of the king, the kingship, and the do's and don'ts for the king, the source of legitimacy for the king. All these things I will discuss on that. Let us see the first thing, that is creating the law and authority. How does Manu and the text tries to do that? I will emphasize on this on one particular point in the next slide, that is the social relation and authority, caste, gender, etc. But let me first begin with the theory of kingship. The story goes like this, that when there was absolute chaos and people didn't know how to live together, there was a matsya. Matsya means the stronger eats the weaker. So, there was the law, liberty, property, everything was in danger, and generally people argue that the reason of the origin of the state. So, God sent Manu on the earth to rule the earth so that people can live peacefully, so that social order can be re-established. That was the main idea behind creation of the state. That is a theory. So, in a way it is a kind of divine origin theory of the state, and the king, though he is absolute, but he is not beyond the responsibilities and duties. The Manu enumerates lot of duties for the king, that what he should do and what he should not do. And not only that he enumerates, it is not only suggestion, but Manu also suggests that if the king does not follow this, what would be the consequence for the king. So, if the do's are not properly followed, then king will lose his control of the people, king would lose the kingdom. If he follows those things, then it will survive much more. Now, this is the way he tries to argue about the kings. I am not going to details of what were the main systems, main value system proposed for the king, but one can understand that in this tradition of Arthashastra, you will find much detail, and when we talk about Kautilya, we find much detailed information about what the king should do and what they should not do. And there are very common factors between all these texts when they talk about these issues. But the real problem is the social laws and authority, how social laws are being created. So Manu probably thought that we have to create hierarchy, and I will come to the hierarchy, what is the problem of the hierarchy. But the text proposes that society could be divided into different varnas, and varnas are based on I don't know if we can call it occupation, but they are certain basis of creating varnas. Now, some people argue that Manu does not suggest that the varnas are to be fixed, that son of a particular group has to join the group by birth, which gives the rise of caste system, that you have three major upper castes on the one hand, and then the Sudras. But definitely Manu proposes certain kind of hierarchy which is based on this idea that the kind of work that they are doing, that is attached to their status, and that is a hierarchy that is created. Similarly, Manu gives lot of do's and don'ts for women and suggests that basically they have to play a subordinate role in society. So he talks about sexuality, he talks about marriage, he talks about intercommunity relationships in marriage, he talks about all kinds of things which actually defines the social system, which defines social laws. I will come to this hierarchy a little later, but let me say that this kind of creation of hierarchy, this kind of creation of caste system and the gender rules based on gender relationship, we do not know whether they were prevalent that time or not, because we have no idea exactly what time it was and how it was being done, and whether Manu's text was created historically at a particular juncture, or it was a text coming out from Vedas. We have no idea about this, but one thing is sure, that this text wanted to create a kind of order in society, and in that kind of order there was a mediation by power. So Manu should also be seen as a philosopher of power. So he is actually trying to distribute power in society in a way that certain people are more powerful and they can control the rest of the people, and he probably thinks that if the power is controlled by some people who are supposed to behave properly, society will be in order. That was the main argument, I think, the main concern, I think. Now, one thing I want to bring here is the nature of the argument. Before I go into detail of the social hierarchy and all, what was the nature of the argument that he was proposing? I think he was very clear. He said that there are three main forms of evidences, and if these forms of evidences are used to argue something, that would be a valid argument. So Pratyaksha is a pramana, Pratyaksha pramana they call it, Anumana pramana and Shabda pramana. So Pratyaksha pramana is something that you can see happening, that you can understand that the evidence can be provided immediately by direct visibility. Anuman praman, that you guess, you inference, you draw inferences, and Shabd Praman is the Praman from the text. Now, probably in Manu Smriti you will find much of Sabda Pramana and less of Anuman and Pratyaksha Pramana, because every time they would refer back to the text, and there is another thing, if even the text is silent, then they would say Sadachar, those people who are Sadacharis, those who are behaving well and those who are accepted by society, there we should ask them what is good, what is bad, and we must follow that. Now, Wendy Donizer observes and calls it the because argument and therefore argument, and both the arguments probably need to be discussed, and this form of argument, she argues, is a very primitive form of argument for drawing legitimacy. So, you can see how this text called Manu Smithy has been a very important text politically and socially also. It has created a lot of controversies in India. However, this text has been received in many ways by people. Of course, one is that the burning of the text particularly by feminist movements and Dalit movements, thinking that the text has actually not only created hierarchy, it has legitimized hierarchy, and it has created worst form of social exploitation. But there is another way of looking at this, and one of the prominent thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche from Germany, he has seen the text very differently, and he probably argues that the text actually is a life affirming representation. But more interesting formulation one can see in terms of psychological interpretation of the text. I will go to that, but before that, let me show that how the text that became so controversial has a theory of hierarchy, and we really need to evaluate not only a form of hierarchy that it has created, but any form of hierarchy that can be created. And we have to ask this question, whether hierarchy created in time, space, gender, or any form, is that a good way to think of a society? Like the Varna Dharma, Ashram Dharma, and gender quotient, there are three ways that Manu Smithy creates hierarchy. There are four Varnas, and the Varnas are not equal, Varnas are not allowed to really intermingle, Varnas are fixed. These are the issues that one can see how creating such hierarchy, he thought, would bring social order. This is not new. Even in the modern period, I think, a lot of people have argued for hierarchy. The bureaucracy, Weber, when he talks of bureaucracy, he thinks of creating hierarchy there also. So hierarchy probably is an arrangement in power relationship. For a stable power relationship, the hierarchy has to be legitimized. There has to be adequate reason for creating hierarchy, and adequate argument for supporting the hierarchy. And the argument that he uses for supporting hierarchy, as we can see, is a because argument, and it is therefore argument. Means the argument that, well, since text is saying this, therefore you must accept it. So I am saying this, I am a wise man, therefore you should accept it. These kind of arguments are actually no arguments. So legitimacy of hierarchy is always in question. Similarly, regarding the hierarchy of age, one can say it is not hierarchy of age, but he prescribes people of which age should do what, and that is the ashram system. That you are in a brahmacharya ashram, you are in a grihastha ashram, you are in a vanaprastha ashram, you are in a sannyasa ashram, four types of ashram. So depending on your age, you have to choose the ashram, and every ashram has a particular role to play. Now the modern system thinks that, well, this is not fair. Everybody has to enjoy the life as much as they can, and age should not be a problem for them. So age related hierarchy is not acceptable to them. Similarly, the gender hierarchy, that women have a particular kind of work to do, and they have to support a male counterpart, and the support is almost so hierarchical that they become subordinate to the male counterpart. But this is what comes out from this text very easily. Now the question that we have to ask is there any relationship between hierarchy and creativity? Is it that a hierarchical society can be more creative, or non-hierarchical organization or society will be more creative? I think this is the question we need to ask, and we need to conduct good research on this. If there has to be hierarchy in order to see that the society functions well, then what would be the basis of hierarchy, and on what grounds shall we maintain the hierarchy, and how can we break the hierarchy? These are the questions that we must ask. I think Manu Smithy throws this challenge to modern researchers to see if hierarchy is a necessary condition for a social well-being. I think it is very difficult to answer. generally speaking, one would say very easily that we should not believe in hierarchy. Hierarchy is bad for creativity. But on the other hand, we see that every system, even if it believes in complete equality, gradually creates hierarchy, and through hierarchy it works. So the dilemma is, if you do not create hierarchy, you may lead to chaos. If you create hierarchy, it is anti-creativity. How to mitigate that? How to solve this problem? I think Manu's text should be seen also in the form of solving this problem, and to what extent he could solve the problem or created new set of problems, that we must see. The other interesting factor in him is that this text actually tries to solve this problem by fixing set of responsibilities for every layer in the hierarchy, to the extent of it that when you are supposed to protect somebody and you, instead of protecting, harm that person, then the punishment for you will be manifold more. So if you know that, similarly, if you know that this is wrong and then you are committing that mistake, then you will be punished much more than somebody who does not know whether it was right or wrong. So Manu creates that kind of system within hierarchy, which I think is very interesting method of fixing responsibility with hierarchy. The more you are the higher you are in the hierarchy, more responsibility you have towards society. You have more immunity also, of course, you have more immunity, but more responsibility, and if you fail to perform that, then you are punished much more. Now this is a model of solving the puzzle that I said, that on the one hand, if you create hierarchy, then you become non-creative. If you not create hierarchy, it becomes chaotic. So probably Manu has this puzzle in his hand, and he was trying to solve this puzzle by fixing responsibility with hierarchy, and in a way that would give immunity but more punishment. So that probably one of the ways of handling this. If you look at the crime and the punishment details of Manu Smithy, you will find that this is the organizing principle of the punishment. For the same crime, everybody is not punished equally. How this inequality in punishment is decided, that is where I think the responsibility is linked with hierarchy. Normally, the modern period, we see there is a rule of law. For the same crime, everybody will be punished the same possible way. And in Manu, in contrast, you have different layers of hierarchy, and every layer has responsibility, and every layer have different kinds of punishment defined for that too. So this has to be examined, to what extent this was an innovation, and to what extent this innovation is creative or good or bad. Without making any judgment at the moment, I only say that this was an interesting take by Manu, and we must examine it carefully. Another thing that I think Manu brought, and a lot of people are arguing it, particularly Glucklich, Ariel Glucklich has an article, which is a very interesting article called Virtue and Happiness in the Law Book of Manu. It is published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies, 2011. Now this article argues that Manu's context is very important, as India was seeing a transition at that time. The dominant Hindu philosophy and way of life was challenged by Buddhism. So in the post-Vedic period, what you find is Upanishad, and then you find Buddhism. So it was a time of churning when people were thinking that how one should behave in society, what could be the norm of society. And there were two kinds of dharma debating among each other. One was pravriti dharma, other was a nivriti dharma. The pravriti dharma means you lead a grihast life, you follow the law of karma, you pursue arth, kam, dharma, and you remain in a social animal. You create a society and you create social laws and follow those laws and regulations. This is the pravriti dharma, means you are living like a normal human being who is interested in fulfilling the arth, kam, dharma, moksha attributes of life, and in that process you follow the routine laws of society. But there is a nivriti dharma. Nivriti dharma means you just transcend these things and follow what you call moksha path. The first was a karma path, other was a moksha path. And moksha path comes from both from Gyan Kand of Upanishad and Buddhism, which is actually a distinct technology of the self. Both pravriti and nivriti could be considered as technology of the self, through which you decide what are you going to do in your life, how do you understand yourself. So nivriti is a very different technology of self, where you divert your attention towards moksha and you start giving up things. Let me repeat. The first is the practice of developing the social self in the line with the norms of varna and ashram. You are a son, you are a student, you are a husband, you are a father, and you enter into many kinds of social relationships. The second, in the sharp contrast, is a practice of unmaking of social self. You discontinue those relationships by attaining metaphysical insights into the nature of one's own agency. So you start looking inward. This is an interesting argument Ariel gives about Manu Smithy, that probably Manu Smithy was being written, or if you want to say accumulated, whatever it was, done at a time when this nivriti and pravriti debate was going on, and Manu Smithy probably synthesized them. He argues, there is more than the Brahminical attempt to integrate the two distinct theology of the Veda and Upanishads. There is also a long-standing psychological wisdom which emerged in the Upanishads and early Buddhism that developed in Yoga Sutra and Bhagavad Gita, and that is what he thinks was being done by Manu Smithy. It was in continuity of this kind of thing that was being done by Manu Smithy. So Manu Smithy was trying to accumulate a kind of psychological wisdom, or explain the psychological wisdom, or enumerate the psychological wisdom. We will talk about what kind of thing it was. Ariel argues that the main finding of Manu Smithy, or the main synthesis of Manu Smithy, was that the physical discipline and the emotional self-control are intrinsically rewarding. The physical discipline and the emotional self-control, these two things are very important. And he thinks that in Manu Smithy, actually, this is what is demonstrated, that you have to control yourself. You have to control yourself physically and emotionally. You should define your emotions in a way that it looks like as if it is in your under control. And if you can do that, then you have many advantages. That's the main finding of Manu Smithy. The first advantage is that the biological response of the self to the external input is in pursuit of homeostasis. The biological response of the self can be managed. Sensory addictive, it becomes sensory addictive. And if you have self-control and physical control, you can manage this sensory addictive response of the biological being. So, the biological being has demands from the body, and you start fulfilling that, then you are reduced to animal being. So, he says that if you, it is not that you do not fulfill that, he says that if you can control that, that controlling gives you an agency, and that is very rewarding. Second thing, he says that you can master over yourself and you can be flexible towards the demands of the society or the nature. The internal input in the pursuit of self-regulation can be designed. So, that will give you immense agency, that you can respond to the outer world the way you want, and that finally gives you very interesting freedom, sense of freedom, that the response to internal input free of external constraint. That is what is the agency that you acquire. I think this is a part of the larger Indian tradition, when the self-control and the emotional self-control and the physical discipline are supposed to provide you certain kind of agency. If you look at Gandhi even, you will find that this is what he was doing. He was doing absolute physical discipline and emotional self-control, and that probably provided him huge agency during the freedom struggle. If you look at his autobiography, you will find it is a story of this combination, what Manu is suggesting. So, Manu gives, according to Ariel, Manu gives a theory of happiness, and the theory of happiness is the center of his text, and that is about the well-being of human beings. The well-being of human beings depends on their emotional state of mind and their physical well-being, and therefore the control that he is suggesting provides a very interesting psychological state through which the well-being is possible. But there is one other element that he brings in which is very interesting. He says that how do you do that? How do you control your physical being? How do you control your emotional being? And how does this control gets transformed into the well-being? He suggests that probably it is through the concept of tapas. Tapas is the heat that you produce when you control yourself, and one of the verses is translated like this: the intelligent men whose vision was the Veda said that all this happening, that is sukha, of gods and humans, has inner heat, tapas, as its roots, inner heat as its middle, and inner heat as its end. So, the sukh that you call, sukh is going beyond the unhappiness and happiness. The sukh is not only happiness, sukh is much more than that. So, that comes from tapas, the self-control, emotional self-control and the control of the body. Both are done through tapas, or generally in Indian tradition the word tap is very popular. Tap is the heat that you generate when you are trying to control these things, trying to bring these things under control. So, he says that tapas is something that brings that virtue in you, that brings that well-being and virtue in you, and therefore he says that sadachari, those who are into tapas, who have controlled these things, they also develop vision, and their vision is beyond the immediate self-interest of the human being. Their vision is a big vision through which one can see for longer distance, and therefore he suggests that apart from pratyaksha pramana or inference pramana, anumana pramana, or the shabda pramana, the tapas pramana or the pramana that comes from sadachar is equally important. And therefore then he argues that how the king should go to the older people and talk to them, or how younger generations should go to the older people and talk to them. Those who have done this tapas have a real vision of the world, and they can bring you some kind of happiness and well-being. That is the larger argument some people suggest Manu is making. So what we have seen in Manu, we have seen two things. On the one hand, Manu is taken as lawgiver, a man, a thinker, who thought by creating hierarchy you can create a better society. By creating hierarchy in terms of different kinds of groups divided as varnas or gender or age, you can create certain kind of norms, and you can give them definite rules how to conduct your everyday life, and if that is there, if that is accepted, then society will be normal society. Society will be not normal, happy society. Now why should I follow the rule? Why should somebody follow the rule? So Manu suggests, as usual, the texts which are generally within the tradition of what you call the traditional thinking or maybe religious thinking, you will find that there are two ways of drawing authorities. One is giving certain kind of argument in favor of the statement. Other is invoking an authority of the god or authority of some wise man. Manu probably does both these things. The problem is that when you are doing these kind of invocations or this kind of argumentation that you try to put forward, actually in the modern times doesn't hold good. In modern times, you really have to explain the reason behind something. Why, if you want to say that, well, you should not do this, then one has to ask why I should not do it. Now, if you want to give a biological argument for this, then biology has developed so much now that you really have to take evidences from that development. I think these kind of texts fail to actually provide those evidences. So if we agree to this point that these texts probably try to collect a lot of wisdom of society and try to bring some order through that, then there is no problem. But if it claims that it is giving you the truth of life, then probably there is a big problem. Now, the other thing that we discussed is the hierarchy that it creates is very important, problematic for people even in the contemporary times. We have been talking about liberty, equality and justice. Even the modern democracies, they started with this idea of liberty, equality and justice, and we all know that ultimately what we have got is a very hierarchized society. So is hierarchy inevitable? And if it is inevitable, then how should we regulate that hierarchy? This, I think, is a question that should be asked to Manu. Manu suggests that hierarchy can be regulated by putting up responsibility with the hierarchy, that you have higher position, therefore higher responsibility, and to ensure that you perform that responsibility, there is a rule of punishment. So those in the those people higher in the hierarchy have more responsibility, and if they don't perform, then they will be punished much more than one who is lower in the hierarchy. This probably was the safeguard for this kind of hierarchical society. Whether this will maintain that kind of peace and harmony or not, that one has to examine. But this is not all that Manu is talking, and a lot of people are now arguing that Manu probably is trying to develop a theory of happiness, theory of well-being of society, and that is where he is trying to bring two things together, kind of two dharmas together, the pravritti and nivritti dharma, and that is where the psychology of well-being emerges, that you learn to give up. When you are involved in something, you also learn to give up. So that is the new dimension that probably one can see in Manu's argument, and the tapas argument, that when you do all these things, you have to have this idea that you are generating the heat that gives you well-being. This is what one can say Manu's idea.
Okay, on that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching discussion, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.